The thing I can't stop thinking about, the detail that lives behind my eyelids every time I try to sleep, is that when I finally ran out of that hospital, I checked my reflection in a parked car window. Just a reflex. Just to make sure I was still me. And for one horrible second, my reflection was a half-beat slow. My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm a registered nurse. Or I was until the night of November 14th, when I worked what I was told would be a routine overnight shift at Ashgrove General Hospital. A building that had no business still being open and certainly no business being haunted. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what kind of place Ashgrove was before I tell you what happened inside it. Because context matters. Because when things start going wrong in a place like that, your mind doesn't immediately leap to the supernatural. Your mind says, old building, faulty wiring, sleep deprivation. Your mind works very hard to protect you from the truth, and I spent most of that night letting it. Ashgrove General was built in 1947. It had been expanded 3 times, once in the 60s, once in the 80s, and once in 2003 in a renovation project that everyone agreed had made the building worse somehow, stranger, as if the new hallways didn't quite connect to the old ones the way they should. The floors didn't always match up. There were half staircases that led to landings that served no apparent purpose. There was a corridor on the 4th floor, the cardiac ward, that turned left when every architectural diagram showed it turning right, and nobody had ever been able to explain why. The staff called it the Crooked Hospital. Affectionately at first, less affectionately as the years went on. I'd been working there for 2 years when this happened. Night shifts mostly. I'd transferred from St. Emmett's downtown after a divorce that I won't get into, looking for overtime and distraction in equal measure. Ashgrove offered both. The overnight staff was thin, too thin honestly for a functioning hospital, and the pay differential for nights was generous enough to quiet the part of my brain that kept asking why exactly so many nurses had quit in the past 18 months. That night, November 14th, I came on at 11 p.m. to cover for a colleague who'd called in sick. Standard protocol. I'd done it 100 times. The charge nurse who briefed me was a woman named Patricia Osei, late 50s, 22 years at Ashgrove, the kind of institutional memory that no hospital can afford to lose. She had a face made for calm. Nothing rattled Patricia. I'd seen her manage a 4-car accident intake without raising her voice above conversational level. She rattled that night. It was subtle. The way she handed me the patient roster without quite meeting my eyes. The way she said, "It should be quiet," with an emphasis on should that I only recognized later for what it was. A woman hedging her bets against something she couldn't name. "Any concerns I should know about?" I asked. She paused. Just a half second, but I caught it. "Keep to your assigned floors," she said. 2, 3, and 5. Don't go above 5 for any reason. What's above 5? 6 is storage. Has been for months, while they're sorting out the water damage from last winter. She was already walking away. 7 is closed. Closed? Has been for 2 years. She stopped at the door to the stairwell but didn't turn back. "There's nothing up there, Daniel. So there's no reason to go." She pushed through the door and was gone. I stood there for a moment in the fluorescent buzz of the nurse's station, holding my patient roster, turning over those last words in my mind. There's nothing up there. Not the floor is under renovation. Not the ward is decommissioned. Just there is nothing there. It's the kind of statement that means exactly what it says, and somehow that makes it worse. The first 2 hours were unremarkable. I did my rounds. Floors 2, 3, and 5. Post-surgical recovery, general medicine, orthopedics. 17 patients across those 3 floors, most of them asleep or sedated, the remainder watching the kind of late-night television that exists specifically to be watched by people who can't sleep and don't want to think. I checked vitals, updated charts, administered a 2 a.m. round of medications. Everything was as it should be. The hospital was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, there's a difference. Peaceful quiet is the absence of noise. What Ashgrove had at 2 in the morning was something more deliberate. The silence of a place that was holding its breath. The building made sounds, of course. Old buildings always do. The pipes groaned with particular enthusiasm, deep, metallic complaints that traveled through the walls and emerged from unexpected places, so that a noise that seemed to originate directly above you might actually be coming from 3 floors down. The fluorescent lights hummed at varying pitches, and they flickered now and then in the way that fluorescent lights do. Nothing supernatural about any of it. I told myself that. I told myself that several times. At 2:45, I was at the nurse's station on the 3rd floor, updating a chart when I heard it for the first time. Scratching. It came from the wall to my left, or rather, from inside the wall. A dry, rhythmic scratching, like fingernails drawn slowly across plaster. It lasted maybe 4 seconds, then stopped. I put down my pen. Listen, nothing. Rats, I thought. Old building. Rats or mice. I made a mental note to mention it to facilities in the morning and went back to my chart. 2 minutes later it came again. Same wall. Same sound. But this time it moved. I swear it moved, traveling slowly upward as if whatever was making the sound was climbing inside the wall. It climbed for about 6 seconds, then stopped abruptly, like something had reached its destination. I stood up. I put my hand flat against the wall, which I knew was pointless but which I did anyway, the way you press your ear against a locked door even though you know you can't hear anything. The plaster was cold. Colder than it should have been, given that the hospital ran its heating system at medically inadvisable temperatures to keep the elderly patients comfortable. I pulled my hand back. The overhead light above me flickered twice, then went still. I picked up my pen, went back to my chart, finished it, moved on. I am a rational person. I was a rational person. I want that on record. At 3:15, the call light above room 512 blinked on. I checked my roster. Room 512, Mr. Harold Voss, 78 years old, admitted 4 days ago with pneumonia. Stable, sleeping, no issues flagged on the previous shift. Not a patient I'd expected to hear from at 3 in the morning. I walked down the corridor to his room. The hallway on 5 was longer than it had any geometric right to be, another one of Ashgrove's architectural quirks, and the lights at the far end were dimmer than usual, casting the linoleum in a yellowish half-dark that made the whole corridor look like a photograph developed too long in the tray. I knocked once, pushed the door open. Harold Voss was asleep. Deeply, demonstrably asleep, chest rising and falling with the slow regularity of a man in no distress whatsoever, oxygen cannula in place, monitors showing normal sinus rhythm, oxygen sat at 96%. Nothing wrong. Nothing that would have triggered him to reach up and press the call button. I looked at the call button on the bed rail. The button you have to deliberately press. The button that doesn't go off on its own. I looked at Harold Voss's hands, both of them folded loosely on his chest, nowhere near the call button. I checked the button for a malfunction. Pressed it myself. The light above the door blinked on, then off when I pressed it again. Functioning perfectly. I wrote it off. Equipment behaves strangely in old hospitals. I'd seen it before. But as I was leaving the room I stopped. There was a smell. Very faint, I almost missed it. Beneath the usual antiseptic odor of the ward, beneath the particular smell of illness and institutional linen, there was something else. Something earthy and cold, like a basement that hadn't been opened in decades. Like soil that had never seen sunlight. I stood in the doorway for a moment, certain I was imagining it. Then Harold Voss, still asleep, eyes still closed, hands still folded on his chest, turned his head slowly toward me. He didn't wake up. His eyes didn't open. His breathing didn't change. He simply turned his head, with the slow deliberation of someone in a dream, until his face was pointing directly at me, and smiled. Not the gentle, unconscious smile of a sleeping man. Something wider. Something that used too many muscles. I left the room. I walked back to the nurse's station with my hands in my pockets so I wouldn't see them shaking. I sat down. I looked at my hands. Sleep deprivation, I thought. I've been working too many nights in a row. You see things. I had worked 4 consecutive overnight shifts that week. I had slept perhaps 14 hours in the preceding 5 days. This was verifiable, rational, sufficient explanation. I almost believed it. At 3:50, I checked the security monitors at the ground floor station. This was part of my protocol when the security guard, a young man named Terry who worked nights and spent most of them asleep in his chair, had to do an exterior walkthrough. He'd asked me when I came on shift if I wouldn't mind glancing at the screens every hour or so while he made his rounds. I was happy to oblige. The monitors showed 12 feeds cycling through the hospital's cameras. Parking lot, main entrance, emergency bay, various corridors. Standard stuff. I watched the cycle twice, saw nothing unusual, except that when the camera feed switched to the 5th floor corridor, I sat up a little straighter. The corridor was empty. Of course it was. No staff, no patients wandering, nothing. Except at the very end of the corridor, right at the edge of what the camera's angle could capture, there was a shadow on the wall that didn't belong to anything. Shadows require objects. They require a light source and something solid to interrupt it. The shadow I was looking at was tall, very tall, disproportionately so, and thin in the way that something with too many joints would be thin. And it was moving. Slowly, yes, almost imperceptibly slowly, but moving, shifting, like something breathing. And there was nothing there to cast it. I stared at the screen for a full minute. The shadow didn't disappear. It didn't resolve itself into something explicable. A mop left leaning against the wall, a wheeled cart, anything. It was just there, a tall, jointed shadow on an empty wall at the end of an empty corridor. The camera cycled to the next feed. When it came back to the 5th floor 40 seconds later, the shadow was gone. I sat very still for a moment. Then I got up and walked to the 5th floor. The corridor was empty. The lights were functioning normally. There was nothing at the end of the hall. No objects, no disturbances, nothing that could account for what I'd seen. The wall itself was bare. I stood there, in the middle of that too long corridor, and I listened. Silence. Then, from somewhere above me, a sound I had no framework for. Not the scratching from before. Something else. A slow, irregular tapping. Not mechanical, not consistent enough to be a machine. Almost like footsteps. But spread too far apart to be a normal walking stride. And coming from a direction that, given the floor plan, shouldn't have been possible. From above the ceiling tiles. From the 6th floor. Which was storage. Which had been abandoned since the winter flood. I'm not the kind of person who goes looking for trouble. I want that understood. I'm methodical, careful, the kind of nurse who documents everything and questions everything and doesn't make assumptions. If you'd asked me before that night whether I would ever go exploring a closed hospital wing at 4 in the morning because of some noises and a camera shadow, I would have laughed. What I did instead of laughing was go to the records room. Patricia had mentioned that floor 7 had been closed for 2 years. I'd worked at Ashgrove for 2 years. That meant it had closed right around the time I started, and I'd never thought to ask about it. Staff didn't talk about the upper floors. I'd assumed this was standard hospital disinterest in irrelevant infrastructure. The records room was on the ground floor, tucked behind the administrative offices. It wasn't locked. There was no reason to lock it, since it mostly held archived billing records and old patient files that had been digitized but not yet disposed of. I'd been in there twice before to look up historical records for long-term patients. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself the smartest thing I could do was go back to the nurse's station and drink bad coffee until my shift ended at 7. Instead, I looked up floor 7. The floor had been designated a long-term care ward, patients with chronic conditions, extended recovery periods, that sort of thing. Beds for 24 patients. Standard staffing. Unremarkable from the administrative record. Until 18 months before the floor closed. The incident reports from that period were thin, deliberately, I thought. There's a way that official records look when someone has been careful about what they put in them. Gaps where you'd expect entries. Vague language where you'd expect specifics. I found 3 incident reports from the final 6 months the floor was operational, all filed by the same charge nurse. A woman named Ruth Callahan who was no longer listed in the staff directory. The first report described a patient, referred to only by initials ME, who had been found in a corridor at 2 in the morning, far from his room, unresponsive to verbal commands. The patient had been admitted 3 weeks earlier and had no documented history of sleepwalking or ambulatory episodes. The report noted that ME had been returned to his room, that no injury was sustained, and that the circumstances of the patient's movement from his room remain unclear. The second report was dated 6 weeks later. Different patient, initials RV, same description, almost word for word. Found in a corridor. Unresponsive. Returned to room. Circumstances unclear. The third report was the one that made me stop. It was dated 2 weeks before the floor closed, and it was filed not about a patient but about a staff member. A nurse, initials DP, who had allegedly entered an unassigned room on floor 7 during rounds and reported, upon exiting, that the room was occupied. The room in question had been verified as empty by the charge nurse and the on-call physician. DP had apparently been distressed and incoherent, and had been sent home early. The floor was closed 14 days later. The stated reason was structural assessment requirements. No structural assessment was ever filed. I sat with these documents for a long time. The records room was very quiet. At some point while I was reading, the light above me flickered. Once, twice, and I didn't look up. I was past the point of jumping at flickering lights. What I was thinking about was the smell in room 512. The cold, basement smell. And the number of days since Harold Voss had been admitted. 4 days. And the fact that in the brief I'd been given at the start of my shift, there had been no room 512 on the original census. I'd assumed it was a late ad. I picked up my patient roster and looked at it carefully for the first time. Harold Voss. Room 512. Admitted, November 10th. I looked at the room numbers around it. 509, 511, 513, 515. Even numbers on one side of the corridor, odd on the other. There was no room 512. I had been in room 512. I had seen Harold Voss in room 512. I had his chart, right here, with his vitals and his medication records. Everything properly documented by me, by the nurse before me, by the physician who'd ordered his care. I walked back to the 5th floor. I walked down the corridor, counting doors. 509, 511. On the left, 508, 510. 512 should have been here, between 511 and 513. There was a wall. A solid, uninterrupted, perfectly ordinary wall. No door. No room number. No room. I think about the decision point a lot. The moment when I should have walked out of the building, gotten into my car, driven somewhere with other people and lights, and called Patricia Osei or administration or literally anyone. The moment when every rational impulse should have overridden whatever I did next. But here's the thing about that kind of dread, the deep, accumulating kind, the kind that builds over hours rather than arriving all at once. It doesn't make you run. It makes you need to know. Because the not knowing is its own kind of horror, and some part of your brain, the primitive part, the part that knows the only way to survive an unknown predator is to locate it, that part takes over. I went to the 7th floor. The stairwell door on the 6th floor landing had a chain through the handle and a padlock. The padlock was the cheap, combination kind, the kind that facilities departments buy in bulk and sets to the default combination because nobody can remember the custom one. I knew Ashgrove's default. Every long-term staff member did. The chain fell away with a sound like drop change. I pushed through the door. Floor 7 was dark. Not uniformly, the emergency lighting, old and yellow, cast a watery light across the corridor in uneven pools, leaving long stretches of shadow between each lamp. The ceiling was lower than I remembered from the floors below, or perhaps it only seemed that way. The corridor stretched ahead of me in a straight line, and the emergency lighting made the far end look much farther away than it should have been. The floor smelled wrong. Not the basement smell from 512, this was different. Older. A combination of disuse and something underneath it, something organic, the way a room smells when it has been lived in for a very long time and then sealed. The doors on either side of the corridor were closed. There were numbers on the doors, 701, 702 and so on, the brass numbers tarnished to near black. I moved slowly, keeping to the center of the corridor, not touching anything. The scratching started again. Not from the walls this time. From behind the doors. From multiple doors, simultaneously, a low and rhythmic scratching, like many sets of fingers drawn across the inside surfaces of those tarnished door panels. I stopped walking. I stood in the middle of the corridor and listened to it, and I told myself that I would turn around now. That there were rats on this floor, a significant infestation, and that they were the explanation for everything. The smell, the scratching, all of it. I stood there and I told myself that, and then the scratching stopped. All of it simultaneously. Every door at once. Silence. And then, from behind the door marked 712, someone said my name. Not loudly. Quietly, the way you speak to someone you know is in the next room. Conversational. Familiar. Daniel. I didn't move. Daniel, you should come in. The voice was wrong in a way that took me several seconds to identify. It was too smooth. Normal speech has micro-variations, the tiny imperfections of breath and tongue and muscle that make each person's voice distinct. This voice had no imperfections. It was like a voice assembled from samples, each phoneme correct in isolation, the whole thing almost but not quite human. I took a step backward. The door to 712 opened. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only thing I have left. I need you to understand exactly what I saw and what I did not see and where the line between them was. The room was lit by the same emergency lighting as the corridor, so my visibility was limited. There were beds in the room, 2 of them standard hospital beds with the rails up, and they were occupied. This was what I noticed first. The beds were occupied. 2 patients, 1 in each bed, lying very still under pale blankets. They were breathing. I could see the rise and fall of their chests from where I stood in the doorway. They were looking at me. Both of them, eyes open, faces turned toward the door with absolute precision, watching me with expressions I couldn't read. Not hostile. Not fearful. The studied, impersonal attention of someone watching something they've seen many times and find mildly interesting. The one in the left bed was a man. Elderly, or he appeared elderly. He was wearing a hospital gown, and his chart was clipped to the footboard of his bed, and when I looked at the chart I recognized the format. Ashgrove's format. Patient name, admitting physician, diagnosis. The date of admission on his chart was September 3, 1987. The one in the right bed was a woman. Her chart said June 19, 1994. They had been here for decades. This was impossible. Obviously, rationally, completely impossible. A hospital floor closed 2 years ago. There were no patients on this floor. There could not be patients on this floor because a floor cannot be sealed and locked and abandoned while people are still living in it, and even if such a thing had somehow occurred, 2 people could not survive in an unattended hospital room for 37 years and 29 years respectively without food or water or medical care, without anyone noticing. They could not be here. But they were breathing. And they were watching me with those careful, impersonal eyes. And then the man spoke. "You're the new one," he said in that same too smooth voice, the assembled voice, the voice with no imperfections. "What?" I said. The word came out as barely a breath. "They always send a new one eventually," the woman said. Her voice had the same quality. Different pitch, same wrongness. "To see if we're still here. Do you need—" I couldn't finish a sentence. My brain was working at about 15% capacity, and the rest was pure animal terror, and what I was doing, I realized, was the thing the animal brain does when it encounters something it has no category for. I was standing very still and speaking slowly and carefully and trying not to trigger anything. "We're fine," the man said. "We've always been fine." He smiled. The same smile Harold Voss had smiled in room 512. What? Too many muscles. And behind me in the corridor, I heard footsteps. I turned. The corridor was empty. Except that at the far end, all the way at the far end, where the emergency lighting gave out and the darkness was complete, something was standing. I could see it the way you see things in a dark room. Not clearly, not in detail, but as a shape against slightly less dark background. Tall. Thin. Wrong in the joints, the way the shadow on the monitor had been wrong, angled at places where a human body doesn't have angles. It was not moving. It was watching me the same way the patients were watching me. With that same patient, impersonal attention. I ran. I don't remember the stairwell. I remember the ground floor and the automatic doors of the main entrance, and the cold November air hitting my face, and the sound of my own breathing. I sat in the parking lot for 2 hours. I couldn't make myself drive. I sat in my car with every lock engaged and every light on, and I stared at the front entrance of Ash Grove General Hospital, and I waited for something to come out. Nothing came out. At 6:30 a.m., 2 day shift nurses arrived for their 7 a.m. handover. Normal. Unremarkable. They went in through the front door, and the door closed behind them, and nothing followed them in. I called Patricia Osei from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring, which told me she hadn't been asleep. It was before 7 on a weekday morning, and she answered on the second ring, which means she was awake, which means she had been waiting. I told her what had happened. All of it. The room that wasn't there. The floor that wasn't empty. The patients with their 30-year admission dates and their assembled voices. The shape at the end of the corridor. She was quiet for a long time. "Go home, Daniel," she said finally. "Patricia, go home. Don't come back for a few days. I'll tell them you're sick. The patient's on 7. We have to. Daniel." Her voice was very careful. Very controlled. "There are no patients on 7. There have never been patients on 7. I saw them. I have their names on their charts. I can tell you. You need to go home." Not unkindly. Almost tenderly, the way you speak to someone who has just received very bad news and hasn't processed it yet. And you need to understand that some things about that building are not things you investigate. They are things you leave alone. The line went quiet. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you known about it?" Another silence. Then, "Go home, Daniel." She hung up. I didn't go back to Ash Grove General. I submitted my resignation by email and never set foot in the building again. I've been told they've hired 2 new nurses to cover my shifts. I don't know whether to feel guilty about that. I've thought a lot about what I saw. I've applied the rational frameworks. Sleep deprivation, stress-induced hallucinations, a kind of waking dream state brought on by accumulated anxiety. I've thought about the ways that very old buildings can generate infrasound, frequencies below human hearing that cause feelings of dread and paranoia and, in some cases, visual disturbances. I've thought about all of this, but I keep coming back to the chart. I wrote Harold Voss's chart. I documented his vitals, his medication, his care. I have the paperwork. I have it here in front of me because I took it from the clipboard when I left the floor. I've looked at it dozens of times. And I can't explain why in the field for patient name, what I wrote isn't Harold Voss. I wrote it myself. I watched my own handwriting make those letters. But when I read the chart now, the patient's name is different. A name I don't recognize. And the admission date is 1989. I also keep coming back to the car window. I don't know how to explain the reflection. I've told myself I was shaking, disoriented, traumatized, that my perception of timing was unreliable, that the reflection was always in sync and I only imagined the delay. I've told myself this story many times. I believe it less each time. Because 3 nights ago I woke up at 3 in the morning, I've been waking up at 3 in the morning, and I sat up in bed in my dark bedroom in my locked apartment 45 minutes from Ashgrove General Hospital. And from inside my wall, slow and rhythmic and deliberate, I heard the scratching. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then it began very slowly to climb. I don't know what was on the 7th floor. I don't know how long it had been there or what the patients were, whether they were real, whether they had ever been real, whether real is even the right question to ask about things like that. I know that 4-7 is still there. I know that whatever lives in those walls hasn't stopped just because I stopped looking. And I know, the way you know things that you can't prove and can't unknow, that something came down those stairs with me. I don't think it's gone home. I think it already is. The death certificate was already filed when I heard him ask for more water. I know how that sounds. I've spent the better part of 11 months trying to find a rational explanation. A drafty hallway, an audio hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation, the particular way sound moves through a building at 3 in the morning when the world has gone quiet enough to invent its own noise. I've tried every explanation that doesn't require me to believe what I know, in the deepest and most animal part of myself, to be true. None of them hold. His name was Edward Marsh. He was 63 years old, a retired civil engineer from a small coastal town whose name I can't bring myself to write, as if writing it might make that place real again, might pull me back to those flat gray skies and the smell of salt in every corridor of Harwich General Hospital. He had been admitted for what looked, initially, like a routine cardiac event, elevated troponins, some ST segment changes, the kind of thing we see a dozen times a month. He was pleasant, quiet. The kind of patient who never complained, who thanked you each time you entered the room, who kept his chart clipped neatly on the footboard and his water glass precisely centered on the bedside table. He died on a Tuesday at 4:47 in the afternoon. I was not on shift. I heard about it in the break room from Carla, one of the day nurses, who said it had been peaceful, that he'd simply stopped. The way she always described it, a doctor's euphemism I'd always found more disturbing than comforting. He'd simply stopped, as if the body were a clock someone had decided to wind no further. By Wednesday morning his room 412, had been cleaned, stripped, and prepared for the next admission. By Wednesday night I was standing outside that room, my hand pressed flat against the door, listening to him breathe. I need to tell you about Harwich General before I tell you the rest. It is not the kind of hospital that appears in medical dramas, gleaming, modern, suffused with the blue-white light of competence. It was built in 1971, and the architecture betrays its era in every uncomfortable way. Long corridors that narrow almost imperceptibly as they extend away from the nursing station, creating the persistent illusion that the hallway is slowly contracting. Drop ceilings that buzz and flicker under fluorescent strips replaced so many times that the fixture covers have yellowed to the color of old teeth. Floors of institutional linoleum in a pattern of green and beige that someone in 1971 must have considered cheerful, and which has since achieved a kind of aggressive grimness through decades of scuffing and chemical cleaning. The 4th floor is the cardiac unit. I had worked it for 6 years by the time Edward Marsh was admitted. I knew it sounds the way you know the sounds of your own home. The particular hesitation in the elevator before it reaches our floor, the steam knock in the pipes above room 407 every night around midnight, the way the fire door at the north end of the hall drags against the floor when someone pushes through it, leaving a low, patient groan that travels through the concrete for surprising distances. I knew those sounds. I had cataloged them without meaning to, the way the brain automatically sorts familiar from unfamiliar, safe from potentially unsafe. It is a survival mechanism. In a hospital, it is also a professional one. You learn to distinguish the beep of a monitor whose lead has come loose from the beep of a monitor reporting something wrong. You learn which patient's breathing changes at night, whose pain comes in at 2 a.m. like clockwork, who will need the basin before they know they need it themselves. I knew that hospital's nighttime grammar intimately, which is precisely why I could not dismiss what I began to hear in the 3 weeks after Edward Marsh died. It started with the call button. I want to be precise about this because in retrospect I think precision is the only tool I have left, the only thing between me and the void that opens up whenever I let myself think too freely about those nights. It was 11:17 on a Thursday evening, which I know because I had just finished updating Mrs. Oduya in 410 and glanced at the clock above her bed before I left. The call board at the nursing station lights up in yellow for general calls, red for emergency. I was halfway down the hall when the board showed yellow for room 412. Room 412 was empty. I checked the board twice. I walked back to the station and looked at it directly. Yellow. 412? No patient assigned. Darren, the overnight tech, had seen it too. He gave me the particular look that passes between hospital staff when something doesn't have an obvious explanation. A look that is not quite alarm, because alarm is a luxury you don't cultivate in clinical settings, but something adjacent to it. Wary. Noting. Must be a short, he said. Probably, I said. I walked down and reset the button manually. The room was dark and empty and smelled of industrial cleaner and, faintly, beneath that, of something I couldn't name, something organic, almost sweet. I told myself it was the floral fabric softener the laundry service used on the pillowcases. I reset the button, stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was necessary, and went back to my rounds. It happened again the following Tuesday. Then the Thursday after that. Then on consecutive nights for 5 nights running. Each time the room was empty. Each time I reset the button. Each time I stood a little longer in the doorway, aware of something I wasn't yet willing to articulate even to myself. The sense that the room was not quite as empty as its contents suggested. I filed a maintenance request. The electrician found nothing wrong. The breathing began about 2 weeks after the first call button incident. I have tried many times since to describe the quality of that sound, tried to find language adequate to what it communicated to my nervous system, independent of any rational processing. The best I have managed is this. It was the sound of breathing the way a photograph is the face of someone who has died. It had the right shape. It contained the right information. But something in the transmission was wrong, some layer of it had been stripped away or replaced with something else, and what remained was a representation of breathing rather than breathing itself, close enough to trigger recognition, wrong enough to trigger something much older than recognition. I heard it first from the hallway. I was doing my 2 a.m. circuit, the long loop from the nursing station down to the fire door and back, when I passed room 412 and stopped. The sound was low, rhythmic, in and out, in and out. Not labored, not alarmed. Simply present. Occupying the silence the way a body occupies a bed. I stood outside the door and told myself I was hearing the ventilation system. I stood there and told myself I was tired, that I was in my 41st hour of a week that had included 2 double shifts and 3 hours of sleep. I told myself all the reasonable things. Then I heard it pause. A single beat of silence, exactly the length of time a person takes between exhale and the next inhale when they are lying very still, when they have heard something and are listening. And then it resumed. I went to the nursing station and sat down and wrote a note about the ventilation and did not go back to that hallway for the rest of the shift. Here is what I knew about Edward Marsh from his chart and from the 2 weeks he spent on the 4th floor. He was a widower. His wife, Patricia, had died 4 years prior, also of cardiac causes. He had mentioned this once with the flat effect of someone who has had a great deal of time to sand the rawness off a fact but who has not entirely made peace with it. He had one daughter who had not visited during his admission. There was a note in the chart. His own note, written in a precise civil engineer's hand on a piece of paper he'd handed to Carla on his 2nd day, that said simply, "In the event of my death, do not contact my daughter. She has her reasons." Carla had flagged it for the social worker, who had called the daughter anyway. The daughter had come for the body but not before it and had not come back. He liked his water very cold. He read engineering journals on a tablet he kept in the drawer of his bedside table. He had a habit of tapping the bed rail in a slow, irregular rhythm when he was thinking. Not anxious tapping but contemplative, the rhythm of a mind sorting through a problem. He had told me on the first night of my shift with him that he liked hospitals. This had surprised me enough that I'd asked him why. Most patients, even the stoic ones, have some complicated feeling about being there. Fear, resentment, the low-grade indignity of institutional dependence. Edward Marsh had said, "I like the feeling of being looked after." Patricia looked after me for 38 years. It's the one thing about hospitals. He had not said this with self-pity. He had said it the way you observe a fact about architecture. Simply with an appreciation for structure. I did not think about this for several weeks after he died. I thought about it constantly afterward. By the 3rd week, other staff had started to notice. Darren mentioned it first, obliquely, in the way people in clinical settings approach the inexplicable, sideways with a great deal of plausible deniability loaded into each sentence. He said he thought there might be a problem with the climate control on that end of the hall, that it had felt warmer near 412. He said he'd noticed the lights flickered more in that section. He said these things carefully, watching my face for confirmation that I was storing the same information he was, that I had noticed what he had noticed, without either of us having to say what it was we had noticed. I said carefully that I'd put in another maintenance request. Then Yolanda, a night nurse who had been on the floor for longer than any of us, who was not given to flights of imagination or unnecessary conversation, who was, in fact, the most anchored and unflappable person I had ever worked beside, said something in the break room during handoff that made the hair on my arms rise in a way it hadn't since I was a child. She said, "You know what's strange? The room still smells like him." She said it the way she'd say that the coffee was cold or that a patient in 408 had been restless. Observation. Data point. What do you mean? I asked. Marsh, she said. Room 412. I went in to check the equipment this morning after Ronaldo said one of the monitors had come on by itself in the night. The room has been empty for 3 weeks. Clean sheets, clean everything. But when I walked in, it still smells like him. That particular soap he used. She shrugged and poured her coffee. I thought about the organic sweetness beneath the industrial cleaner on the first night. I had not known then that I was already smelling him. I need to tell you about the monitor. Ronaldo had mentioned it in passing during handoff, the way Darren had mentioned the call button, matter-of-factly, with the implication that it was a mechanical anomaly, a glitch, something for engineering to address. He'd been doing his rounds at around 3:30, he said, and as he passed 412 the cardiac monitor had activated. Not alarmed, not the sharp, insistent beeping of a monitor detecting a problem, but simply come on, the screen lighting up, displaying the flat green line of a monitor connected to nothing, looking for a patient it couldn't find. By the time he'd gone in to check it, it had shut off again. I thought about this for the rest of that day. A cardiac monitor coming on by itself in an empty room. Searching in its simple electronic way for a heartbeat. Finding none. Shutting off. I don't know which interpretation of that image disturbs me more. The idea that the monitor had malfunctioned, responding to nothing, displaying its useless flat line for no audience. Or the idea that it had not malfunctioned. That it had found exactly what it was looking for. That the flat line was accurate. The first time I heard my name, I wasn't certain I had. It was just past 2 in the morning, 5 weeks after Edward Marsh's death. The floor was quiet. Genuinely quiet, the particular quality of quiet that a hospital achieves in its deepest hours, when the building seems to have taken a breath and held it, when the beeping and hissing and murmuring that constitute its ambient life have settled into something closer to a pulse than a cacophony. I was at the nursing station, updating a chart, and I heard, from the direction of 412, from the length of corridor away that made it small and remote, like something heard from underwater, a voice say my first name. Not clearly, not loudly. The way you might say someone's name when you've almost but not quite fallen asleep, when the membrane between waking and dreaming has gone thin, that soft, involuntary murmur that means nothing and is shaped by coincidence like something. I looked up. The hallway was empty. The light above 412 was not on. The call board showed nothing. I went back to the chart. 2 minutes later, I heard it again. This time there was no ambiguity about its direction. It came from room 412. It came through the closed door of room 412, through 30 feet of corridor, and it reached me with the specific intimacy of something spoken just for me, just quietly enough that it required my full attention to receive. My name. Said in a voice that was low and calm and male and entirely devastatingly familiar. I stood up from my chair. I'm not a person who frightens easily. You cannot be in this work. You develop a relationship with mortality that is, necessarily, professionally, at some remove from the raw terror of it. You learn to move toward the thing that frightens you because the thing that frightens you in a hospital is almost always a patient who needs you to move toward them. But I stood at the nursing station for what felt like a very long time before I moved toward room 412, and when I finally did, I found that I was walking more quietly than I normally would, placing my feet with more care, as though trying not to announce my approach. As though not wanting whatever was inside to know I was coming. The door was closed. I stood outside it. From within, the breathing, steady, patient, occupying the room. Then, through the door, in the voice I had come to recognize over 2 weeks of night shifts and water refills and the quiet conversation that grows between a nurse and a patient in the particular intimacy of late-night care. I'm still here. I put my hand on the door handle. I did not turn it. I know, I said to the door. The breathing continued for a moment. Then, a sound I had no framework for, not quite a sigh, not quite satisfied, but somewhere between them. Then silence. I did not open the door that night. I called in sick the next 2 evenings. I'm not proud of this. I have, in 6 years of cardiac nursing, called in sick 3 times. Twice for genuine illness, once for a family emergency that I did not have the vocabulary at the time to correctly identify as a mental health crisis. I do not abandon my patients. It is the thing I am most certain about, professionally, the lodestar of what I consider myself to be. But my patients as a category are alive. They are alive and afraid and in pain, and they need me, and for that need I will walk through any exhaustion, any discomfort, any clinical difficulty. That is the contract. I did not know how to apply that framework to a man who was dead and apparently still in residence in room 412. I spent those 2 nights in my apartment, sitting on my couch with the television on and the sound off, running through the logical architecture of the situation the way you check a bridge's load-bearing calculations, looking for the place where the structure failed, where the implausible became impossible, where I could locate my error and rebuild from there. There was no such place. Edward Marsh had died. I had confirmed this through the formal channels. The death record, the discharge of his belongings, the reassignment of his room. These were not ambiguous data points. These were institutional facts, documented in triplicate, signed by physicians and administrators whose job was to be certain about exactly this kind of thing. And in his former room, 5 weeks after his documented death, something that knew my name breathed in the dark and waited. On the 3rd night I went back. I'm going to try to describe what the following 2 weeks were like as precisely as I can, because I think precision is still the only thing I have. I went back and it escalated. That is the word. Not worsened exactly, it was not worse in the sense of more frightening, though it was that too. It was more present, more assured. As though my 2-night absence had been a test that I had, by returning, passed, and the thing in 412 had decided to reward my presence with more of itself. The smells intensified. Not just his soap now, but something beneath it, something that the soap had covered when he was alive and that no longer had need of covering, wet earth and something medicinal, formaldehyde adjacent, the smell of preservation or its failure. The sounds expanded. Not just breathing now but movement, the small percussive sounds of a patient shifting in a bed, the soft drag of skin on linoleum that might be bare feet, once or twice the sound of water running, filling, the particular hollow sound of a hospital water glass being set down on a hard surface, and the tapping. The irregular, contemplative tapping on the bed rail. The rhythm of a mind working through a problem. That sound, more than anything else, is what dissolved the last of my rational resistance. Because I had never told anyone about the tapping. It was not in the chart. It was not something I had mentioned in handoff or in conversation. It was a private thing, noted only by me, filed in the private catalog of observations that nurses accumulate and never fully articulate. There was no mechanism by which whatever was in that room could have known to tap that rhythm, except one. On the 14th day after I returned, I found the shadow. I have been reluctant to write this part because it is the part where my account begins to sound like the thing it is, rather than the thing I wish it were. Up to this point I have been able to maintain the pretense, at least in the telling, of clinical observation. Sounds, smells, electrical anomalies, the kind of phenomena that accumulate strangely but resist, individually, the label I am working toward. The shadow is harder. It was just past 3 a.m. I was standing in the hallway outside 412, closer than I had been standing before, within arm's reach of the door, which I had been approaching incrementally over the past 2 weeks, the way you approach an animal you're not sure is safe, with patience and no sudden movements. The light above the door was on. Not called, on, spontaneous, without explanation. It threw a rectangle of yellow light onto the linoleum at my feet. I was looking down at that rectangle when I noticed the shadow at the base of the door. There is a gap between the bottom of every door on the 4th floor and the linoleum, maybe an inch, maybe slightly more. Through that gap, when the interior light of a room is on and the hallway light is off, you can see a sliver of the room's lit interior. If someone is standing near the door inside the room, you see their shadow. This shadow was not standing. It was sitting. The shape of it was the shape of a person in a bed, the angular rise of knees under a sheet, the slope of a torso propped on pillows, the rounded suggestion of a head. It was imprecise, the way shadows are imprecise. But it was there. It was occupying the bed that had been empty for 7 weeks. As I watched, it moved, slowly. The head turned, toward the door. And the shadow that fell beneath the door grew larger, not because the light source had moved, but because what cast it had leaned forward, toward me. I took 1 step back, then another. The light above the door clicked off as if in response, and the shadow was gone, and the sliver beneath the door showed only the dark interior of an empty room. From inside very clearly, "Don't go," I told Yolanda. I had not planned to. I had planned to endure this alone, in the particular silence that medical professionals maintain around the things they cannot explain or cannot afford to explain. The same silence that surrounds near-death experiences reported by patients, the same silence that surrounds the things that happen in hospitals at night that never make it into the chart. But I told Yolanda because Yolanda had smelled him in the room, because Yolanda had planted her flag in the territory of the inexplicable without panic, and because I was running out of places to put what I was accumulating. We sat in the break room at 4 a.m. with bad coffee and she listened to everything. All of it. The call button, the monitor, the breathing, my name, the tapping, the shadow. She did not interrupt. She did not offer the comforting alternatives that I had already exhausted on myself. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He doesn't want to leave." "I know," I said. "Do you know why?" I thought about a man who liked hospitals because they felt like being looked after. I thought about Patricia, dead 4 years. I thought about a daughter who had her reasons and had not come until there was a body to collect. I thought about an empty room that still, after 7 weeks, smelled of the man who had last been alive in it. "I think he's lonely," I said. Yolanda looked at her coffee. "That's the worst kind," she said. "I should have requested a room change. I should have gone to management and said that room 412 had developed an anomaly, kept it clinical, kept it within the language of institutional process. I should have done a great many things that would have put distance between me and what was happening in that room. Instead, I went back. I went back because I understood something that I hadn't at the beginning, something that had assembled itself from all the small pieces over 7 weeks. The thing in room 412 was not haunting me. It was not malevolent. It was not reaching for me out of hunger or hatred or any of the motives that horror attributes to the restless dead. It was lonely, and I was the person who had been kind to it when it was alive, and it knew my name. That knowledge cost me more sleep than the fear had. On a night in the 8th week, on a shift that had been quiet enough to feel conspiratorial, I walked to room 412 at 2:47 a.m. and I put my hand on the door handle and I turned it and I walked in. This is the part one have the most difficulty with. Not difficulty writing, difficulty with the nature of what I experienced, with the way memory treats it, with the fact that what I am about to describe is simultaneously the most vivid and the most structurally unstable thing in my experience, the thing that is most present when I close my eyes and most resistant to the requirements of linear narrative. I'm going to do my best. The room was not dark. I had expected dark or the faint green glow of monitor standby, the expected visual palette of an unused clinical room at 3 in the morning. Instead, the room held a light I have no adequate name for. Not bright. Not warm exactly. A low, diffuse illumination that seemed to come from the room itself rather than any fixture. The light you sometimes see when you're in the shallow end of a dream and not yet aware you're dreaming, present enough to see by sourceless, unarguable. In that light I saw Edward Marsh. He was in the bed. He was sitting as I had always seen him, propped on pillows, the sheet folded neatly at his waist, his hands resting one atop the other. He was dressed in the hospital gown he'd worn during his stay. His water glass was on the table, precisely centered. He looked at me and I looked at him, and for a moment that may have been seconds or may have been much longer, neither of us said anything. Then I saw what was wrong. There was a second Edward Marsh. He was in the chair beside the bed. The vinyl visitor's chair that every room on the 4th floor has, positioned as it always is, angled slightly toward the bed. He was sitting in it the way patients sometimes sit when they're feeling well enough to get up but not well enough to want to be far from the bed. He was wearing street clothes. He looked younger, not dramatically but perceptibly, the way you look younger in photographs taken before a specific grief has had time to settle into the lines of your face. Both of them were looking at me. The one in the bed, the version I knew, the version that had been in that room for the last months of his life, said, "You came." His voice was exactly as I remembered it. Mild, precise. With the particular quality of someone who chose their words with the care of a man accustomed to load-bearing calculations, to the importance of getting the measurement right. The one in the chair said nothing. He was looking at me with an expression I recognized and couldn't place, the way you sometimes recognize a face that belongs to a context you've forgotten. "Mr. Marsh," I said. My voice was steady, which surprised me. "You died 8 weeks ago." "I know," said the one in the bed. "You can't stay here." He looked at me, both of them looked at me, with something I can only describe as patient disagreement. "She's waiting," he said. "Patricia. She said she would. But I don't know the way." "The way?" "Out of here. I know you think I should know, but I don't. I've tried the door." He looked toward the door I just entered through. "Every time I go through it, I'm back in the room." I thought about the way the hospital's long corridors narrow almost imperceptibly, the visual trick of geometry that made them seem to contract. I thought about a room that had been cleaned and emptied and still held the presence of the man who'd last been alive in it. "How long does it feel like you've been here?" I asked. Pause. The one in the bed looked at the one in the chair. Some communication passed between them that I was not equipped to read. "Not long," said the one in the bed. "A little while. I keep thinking the nurses will come." 8 weeks. 8 weeks, and it felt to him like a little while. "I come," I said. "I know. That's why I asked for you. Here is where I need you to understand something about what the room was doing, because it didn't stop at 2 Edward Marshes. As I stood there in that sourceless light, the room began to change. Not rapidly, not the kind of change that snaps you into fight or flight. Slowly, the way fog comes in. A gradual alteration of conditions that you register first as a feeling and only afterward as a perception. The bed was occupied again by someone I didn't recognize. An elderly woman, eyes closed, the slow ventilated breathing of someone deeply sedated. She was not Edward Marsh, and she was wearing clothing from a different decade. I could see the hem of a housecoat, a floral print that belonged to the 1980s. She was in the bed at the same time he was. And beyond her, in the same bed, simultaneously occupying the same space without conflict, a young man, late 20s, a cast on his left arm, reading something, a magazine, dog-eared, of a vintage I could not identify. He didn't look up. The room held all of them at once, layered like transparencies laid one atop another, each one complete in itself, each one unaware of the others. All the patients this room had ever held, I understood. All of them in their moment of greatest need, their moment of greatest vulnerability, preserved in the room the way a room retains the warmth of a body after the body leaves. Some of them were looking at me. Not all. Not most. But some, including Edward Marsh, who looked at me with that calm, precise attention, were aware of my presence in a way the others were not. "Can you help me?" he said. "I want to tell you that I had an answer. I want to tell you that there is a protocol for this. That somewhere in my 6 years of training and practice there is a rubric for guiding the residual presence of a deceased patient out of his room. I want to tell you that I said something adequate to the moment. What I said was, 'I don't know how.'" He nodded, as if this were the answer he had expected. As if the answer were sufficient. "You could stay," he said. There was a quality to the invitation that I did not understand at first as an invitation. It sounded like hospitality, the mild, precise hospitality of a man who was grateful for company and wanted to extend it. It was only later that I understood what staying would have meant. The light in the room shifted. I have tried to identify a trigger, something I did, some threshold I crossed or failed to cross. But the best I can say is that the room, which had been holding all those layers in precarious coexistence, seemed to exhale. The other patients, the woman in her housecoat, the young man with the cast, faded in the way images fade from a screen when the power is cut, not instantly but in a brief, dimming curve. Edward Marsh remained. Both of him. The one in the chair, the younger one, the pre-grief one, stood up. He walked toward the bed, and as he moved through the dim, impossible light of that room I saw that he was not casting a shadow. Not because the light was sourceless and therefore shadowless, but because he himself was the shadow, or had become it, was becoming something that the eye processed as a man but that was organized differently, around a different geometry, the way certain optical illusions resolve into something other than what you first perceived and then resist resolving back. He reached the bed and sat on its edge. The one I knew, the one who had asked me for water and tapped the bed rail in his contemplative rhythm and told me about Patricia, looked from him to me. "She's waiting," he said again. "Go to her," I said. I don't know where the certainty came from. I don't know where the words came from, in what clinical or spiritual or simply human register they were located. But I said them and I meant them, and in the room's impossible light they sounded, to me, correct. Something happened that I cannot describe. This is not rhetorical. I have tried, over 11 months, in 3 different attempts at writing this account, and I cannot find language that is both accurate and legible. The closest I can get is, both versions of him resolved into one. The same way, in the optical illusion, the vase becomes 2 faces and you can never again see only the vase. The room was empty. The light was ordinary, or rather, no light at all, the dark interior of an unused room at 3 in the morning. The bed was smooth, unoccupied, its pillow uncreased. The visitor's chair was angled toward the bed at its customary angle. The water glass was gone from the bedside table. I stood in the dark of the empty room and I breathed, and my breathing was the only breathing in it, and I stood there for a long time. I thought it was over. I want you to understand how completely I believed that. I had walked into something I could not explain, and I had said the right words, or the only words I had, and the room had emptied. Edward Marsh had gone. There was no longer a smell of him beneath the industrial cleaner. The call button did not activate. The monitor did not come on searching for a heartbeat. For 4 days, room 412 was quiet. A new patient was admitted, a Mr. Fenton, 67, post-stent, uncomplicated. I cared for him with the particular attention of someone performing an act of reclamation, reasserting the room's ordinary function through ordinary clinical work. He recovered well. He was discharged on a Friday. That Friday night, alone in the break room at 4 a.m., I became aware that the smell was back. Not his smell. Something different. Wet earth and preservation, the smell without the soap on top of it, the smell I now associated with the layer of things beneath the human-smelling things. I sat very still with my coffee and told myself it was the air system, and told myself it was fatigue, and told myself all the things I had told myself at the beginning. Then, from the direction of my own locker, from inside the bag I take to and from the hospital every day, from the specific pocket in which I keep my phone and my keys and small personal objects. Tapping. Low, slow, irregular. Contemplative. The rhythm of a mind working through a problem. I have asked myself many times since, what exactly happened in room 412? Whether I helped him the way I intended. Whether the resolution I witnessed was a departure or a transformation. Whether what I thought was a man finding his way out was actually something finding its way in. I think about the invitation, you could stay. I think about the way certain things attach themselves to the living, not out of malice but out of need, the deep structural need of something that was human and has lost the architecture of humanity and is trying to reconstruct it through proximity to someone who still has it. I think about the smell that now lives in my apartment. Not strong, barely perceptible, the way a habit is barely perceptible to the person who has it. But there. A permanent low note beneath the ordinary smells of my ordinary life. I think about the nights when I wake at 2:47 a.m. without an alarm, as reliably as if I were still on shift, and lie in the dark and listen to the silence and hear or believe I hear, or cannot distinguish between hearing and not hearing, breathing. Patient, rhythmic, beside me in the dark. I think about the face I see sometimes in the bathroom mirror, not my reflection but the reflection behind my reflection, there for a fraction of a second, gone before I can look directly at it. Mel. Older. Looking at me with the expression of a man grateful for company. I think about the call I received last week, which I answered on the third ring and which was silent on the other end, not dead air but occupied silence, the silence of someone present and listening, and which, before I hung up, produced one sound. My name. Said the way it is said to someone you've been waiting for. Room 412 has had several patients since Mr. Fenton. I checked the occupancy log. None of them reported anything unusual. The call button has not malfunctioned. The monitor has not activated in the night. Yolanda asked me about 3 weeks after the night I entered the room, whether the situation had resolved itself. I said I thought it had. She nodded, with the particular expression she uses when she knows the full sentence and is agreeing only to the part she was given. She said before she walked away, "Be careful with the ones who are lonely. They hold on to whatever they can reach." I have turned this over for 11 months. I think now that she was not warning me about Edward Marsh. I think she was warning me about what Edward Marsh might have left inside me, the void-shaped space that was created by the intimacy of those weeks, by the particular closeness of caring for someone in their dying and then in whatever comes after their dying. The kind of space that something formless and desperate and dead might recognize as a room, as somewhere it might finally belong. I have started to notice things about myself that I did not notice before. The way I sometimes pause at corners before turning them, as if listening for something on the other side. The way certain rooms in my apartment have, over the past few months, developed distinct qualities of presence. Not threatening, not alarming, simply occupied in the way a room is occupied when someone has recently left it and their warmth is still in the air. The way I have stopped minding being alone. The way, on the worst nights, I find myself looking forward to 2:47 a.m. Here is the last thing. 3 weeks ago I was passing room 412 on my way back from the medication dispensary, at 2:50 in the morning, and I glanced in through the window in the door. There was a patient inside, an older man admitted that afternoon whose name I will not write. He was sleeping. On the visitor's chair beside his bed, partially in shadow, was a figure. It was sitting with the posture of someone comfortable. Not menacing, not tense, but settled, the way you sit in a chair you've sat in many times. It was facing the sleeping patient. It was not facing me. But as I stood at the window, it turned its head toward me. I could not see its face in the shadow. I did not need to. I moved my hand up slowly to the glass. A greeting or an acknowledgement. The thing that you do when you see someone you know. The figure in the chair raised its hand. And then I continued down the hall and I finished my rounds and I went back to the nursing station and I sat down, and I noted in the chart that the patient in room 412 was sleeping comfortably, and I did not look up when the monitors beeped in the night, or when the call button briefly lit and extinguished itself, or when the faint sound of tapping, low, slow, contemplative, drifted down the corridor from somewhere I no longer needed to investigate. Some things stay in hospitals. Some of those things are not patients anymore. Some of them were once and simply never found the door. And some of them, I have started to think, lying awake at 2:47, listening to the sound of someone else's breathing in my dark apartment, feeling the contented stillness of a room that is no longer only mine, some of them found something better than the door. They found someone willing to carry them out. I don't yet know what I will find when I look in my own mirror long enough. I'm not certain the face looking back will always be one face. I have noticed lately that I no longer need the lights on. That I have begun to tap, absently without thinking about it, the bed rails of my patients as I leave their rooms. An irregular rhythm. Contemplative. The rhythm of a mind working through a problem it will not solve tonight. Maybe not any night. But it is patient. Whatever is in me now is deeply, quietly, endlessly patient. And the hospital is very full of people who need looking after. The water glass on my kitchen table is always cold. I don't remember filling it. The monitor showed a flat line before I even reached the nursing station. That was the first wrong thing. Not the alarm itself, not the crackling intercom spitting static in the automated code blue announcement, but the fact that the monitor was on. Ward 7 North had been dark for 11 years. The breakers for that entire wing had been pulled and locked in a gray metal box in the facility's office since before I'd started working at Hargrove Memorial. I knew this because I had personally checked that box during my first week as night supervisor, back when I still believed in being thorough, back when I still believed that a hospital was simply a building where sick people came to get well, and that the spaces between those certainties were occupied only by paperwork and fatigue. I was standing at the central nursing station on 6 South, halfway through a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, when the alarm came through. Not on my pager. Not on the overhead system. Not on any of the active ward monitors arranged in their familiar grid on the desk in front of me. It came through the old intercom panel, the one bolted to the wall beside the supply closet, the one I'd always assumed was decorative, a relic of the hospital's original construction in 1971, its speaker grill clogged with dust and its indicator lights long since burned to nothing. One of those lights was on. Red, steady, unblinking. And from the speaker, in a voice so crisp and unhurried that it raised every hair on my forearms, Code Blue Ward 7 North, Room 712. Code Blue Ward 7 North, Room 712. All available staff, please respond. I set down my coffee. I looked at Denny, the overnight orderly who was supposed to be restocking the linen cart but had stopped with a folded sheet pressed to his chest, staring at the intercom panel with his mouth slightly open. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He turned to look at me, then back at the panel, then at me again. "That's 7 North, he said. "I know. That wing is." "I know," I said again. I picked up the desk phone and called the operator. The line rang 11 times before connecting to voicemail. I called the on-call physician, Dr. Renata Voss, and the line rang through to her answering service. I called the facility's office and got nothing at all. Not even a ring, just a soft, oceanic silence that seemed to breathe. The intercom crackled again. Code Blue Ward 7 North, Room 712. The same voice, the same unhurried cadence. But this time, beneath the words, almost too low to register, almost something I could convince myself I had imagined, a sound like a person drawing breath through fluid. Wet and labored and desperate. Denny had backed away from the linen cart. He was young, 23 or 24, and there was nothing performative about the way the color had left his face. It was simply gone, the way color leaves a thing when the light source is removed. "I need you to stay here," I told him. "Keep trying the operator. Keep trying Dr. Voss. If you can't reach anyone in 10 minutes, go down to the ER and find Dr. Castellano personally." "You're not seriously going up there," he said. I clipped my master keycard to my lanyard. I picked up the emergency response bag from the hook beside the station. The bag that held the portable defibrillator, the airway kit, the crash supplies. I'd carried it to 100 code blues and 15 years of nursing. The weight of it was familiar, reassuring. "Someone set that alarm off," I said. "I need to find out who." I did not say what I was actually thinking, which was this: there is no one who could have set that alarm off. Because setting off a code blue alert from 7 North would require being inside 7 North, which would require bypassing 2 sets of locked fire doors and a keypad security system that hadn't been active for over a decade. It would require a working intercom panel. It would require electricity flowing through circuits that had been dead since the winter of 2013. It would require, in the most literal possible sense, something that could not be there. I pushed through the stairwell door and began to climb. The stairwell smelled different above the 6th floor. I noticed it before I'd even reached the landing. A change in the air, subtle at first, the way temperature shifts when you move from a heated room to an unheated hallway. But it wasn't cold exactly. It was still. The air on the 6th floor had movement to it, the ambient circulation of an active ward, the breath of ventilation systems, the soft displacement caused by people walking in, doors opening and closing. The air above the 6th floor had none of that. It was the air of a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. And beneath the stillness, beneath the neutrality of stale air, something else. Something I recognized and simultaneously refused to name, because naming it would require me to commit to a conclusion that I was not yet prepared to reach. It smelled faintly of antiseptic. Recent. As though someone had mopped the floor within the last hour. I stopped on the landing between 6 and 7 and stood very still, listening. Below me, the ordinary sounds of the hospital continued. The distant elevator chime, the muffled PA announcement on the surgical floor, the specific rhythm of a hospital at 3 in the morning, busy but contained, purposeful. Above me, nothing. The specific and absolute nothing of an empty space. And then, from somewhere above, a sound. A single, soft creak, like weight settling into an old floor. I told myself it was the building. Buildings breathe. Hospitals, especially old ones, have their own internal architecture of sound. Expansion and contraction, the movement of pipes, the subtle flex of concrete. I told myself this in a deliberate, methodical way, the way you'd explain something to a child who is frightened of the dark, which is to say that I did not entirely believe it but found the explanation useful. I continued up the stairs. The door to the 7th floor was a fire door, the kind with a small wire glass window set at eye level and a magnetic lock controlled by the security panel on the wall beside it. The panel was dead, had been dead for years, its display blank, its keypad unlit. The door should have been passively locked, openable only from the inside or with my master keycard. I pressed my keycard to the reader. Nothing happened. The light did not change. The lock did not disengage. I pressed it again, holding it longer this time, and on the edge of my hearing, or perhaps inside my head, in the place where imagination and perception are insufficiently distinguished, I thought I heard something behind the door. Not a footstep. Not a voice. A pulse. Low, rhythmic, metronomic. Like a heartbeat amplified and slowed. Like the sound a cardiac monitor makes when everything is still working. I pressed my shoulder against the door, testing it, expecting resistance. It swung open immediately. Unlocked. Unlatched. As though someone had been waiting on the other side and had simply stepped back to let me through. The first thing I saw was the light. Not darkness. I had expected darkness, had brought the small flashlight clipped to my badge for exactly that reason. But the corridor of Ward 7 North was illuminated. Not brightly, not with the full fluorescent glare of an active ward, but with a low, amber, sourceless glow. The kind of light that seems to come from the walls themselves rather than from any fixture. The kind of light that exists in the moment before sleep when the room around you has lost its specifics and becomes simply present. The corridor stretched ahead of me, perhaps 30 meters long, lined on each side with closed doors. Patient rooms. 12 of them, 6 to a side, their placard slots still showing old room numbers and faded adhesive letters. The linoleum floor, which should have been gray-white with age, seemed almost clean, or not clean exactly, but preserved. The dust that should have accumulated in 11 years of abandonment was there. I could see it, a thin film on every horizontal surface, but it lay in patterns that troubled me. Not the uniform, undisturbed settling of a truly untouched space. Instead, it had been moved. Disturbed in long, sweeping arcs, as though something had been dragged, or as though someone had been walking in something. A garment, a gown, had been trailing behind them. The nursing station was halfway down the corridor on the left. I moved toward it, my footsteps loud and definitive in the silence. Each one an announcement of my presence that I immediately wished I could take back. The station's desktop was bare except for a film of dust and a single chart holder empty. The phone on the counter had no cord. The monitors, 4 of them, arranged in the same configuration as the stations on active wards, were dark. Except one. The third monitor from the left was displaying a cardiac waveform. I stood and looked at it for a long moment. The waveform was not flatlined. It was not the chaotic, irregular pattern of a heart and ventricular fibrillation, which would have been bad but at least within the taxonomy of things I understood. It was a normal sinus rhythm. Slow, perhaps 45 beats per minute, but regular. Orderly. The waveform of a sleeping person or a person in deep sedation, or a person at the very edge of something. The patient readout in the corner of the screen showed, bed 712A. No name. No admission number. No physician code. Just the bed number and the waveform, moving with the slow, undeniable rhythm of a living heart. I took out my phone to photograph it and found that my phone screen was showing 3:14 a.m., which was correct. I had checked the time before leaving the nursing station downstairs, and it had been 3:12 when I started up the stairs. 2 minutes had passed since I left the 6th floor. I looked at the phone for a moment, then at the clock on the nursing station wall. The clock on the wall showed 3:14 a.m. Both correct. I put the phone back in my pocket. I moved down the corridor toward room 712. It was the last room on the right at the very end of the wing, where the corridor terminated in a set of emergency exit doors. I passed the other rooms as I walked, and I did not look through their small rectangular windows. I made a deliberate choice not to, and I am not proud of it, but I am not going to pretend I was braver than I was. The sounds coming from behind those doors, sounds I might have dismissed as pipes or building settle, or the ambient acoustics of an old wing, were too rhythmic, too purposeful. Too much like the sounds of rooms that are occupied and in use, the soft and intimate sounds of people being tended to, the creak of a mattress taking weight, the rattle of something on a tray. Once, just as I passed room 708, the quiet, exhausted sound of someone crying. I stopped outside room 712. The door was closed. The window in the door, the same small wire glass rectangle as all the others, was dark, or not dark but fogged. As though the temperature inside the room was significantly different from the corridor, as though condensation had built up on the inside of the glass. I put my hand on the door handle. From inside the room, clear and unmistakable, the sustained, unwavering tone of a cardiac monitor flatline. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was larger than standard, a corner room with windows on 2 walls, both covered by the kind of institutional curtains that hospitals use, heavy cream-colored fabric on metal tracks. In the amber half-light that seemed to follow me from the corridor, I could see the basic geography of the space. A bed in the center, a bedside table and 4-pole, a monitoring setup on an articulated arm, a visitor's chair in the corner. All standard. All expected. All covered in a layer of dust that told me, unambiguously, that no one had been in this room for years. The monitor was screaming its flatline tone into the dust and the stillness. I could see the line on the screen, dead straight, horizontal, final. The lead wires dangled from the machine, their adhesive electrode pads hanging free, touching nothing. And yet, in the bed, beneath the thin hospital blanket, there was an impression. A shape. The blanket was not flat. It described the contour of a body, the rise of feet, the longer slope of legs, the swell of a torso and the smaller elevation of a head against the pillow. The shape of a person lying on their back, perfectly still. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time. Then I crossed the room to the bedside. The blanket was empty. I pulled it back, carefully, the way you'd approach a thing you were not yet certain of, and there was nothing beneath it but the mattress, striped ticking gray and white, with the particular compression pattern of a mattress that has held a person for a long time. A shallow, body-shaped indentation in the foam, the kind that doesn't spring back. But the indentation was warm. I pressed my palm into it and the warmth was undeniable. Not the residual warmth of a surface that had been heated by sun through a window, or by proximity to a heat source. Body warmth. The specific temperature of a person who has just left a bed. The monitor continued its flatline tone. I reached over and silenced it. In the sudden quiet, I became aware of several things simultaneously, in the way that acute attention sometimes works. Not sequentially but all at once, a single intake of perception. The room smelled of antiseptic, strongly, freshly, as though it had been cleaned within the hour. On the bedside table, beside the empty water cup and the call button that connected to nothing, there was a chart. A physical patient chart in a manila folder, its edges soft with handling, its surface free of dust in a way that nothing else in the room was. As though it had just been placed there. On the 4-pole, a bag of saline was hanging, plump and full, with the tubing running down to an 4-line that connected to nothing, its end free, its connector cap dangling. And the door behind me, which I had left open when I entered, was closed. I turned. The door was closed. I had not heard it close. I could not hear now any sound from the corridor beyond it. Not the ambient nothing of the empty wing, not the distant sounds of the floors below. Just the total pressurized silence of a room that has been sealed. I picked up the chart. The cover sheet showed, patient, John M. Aldridge. D.O.B., March 3, 1941. Admission, November 14, 2013. Physician of record, Dr. H. Vanek. Primary diagnosis, acute myocardial infarction. Room, 712A. November 14, 2013. Ward 7 North had been closed in December 2013, following what the official hospital record described as a critical incident. I had always assumed the critical incident was a regulatory violation or a staffing crisis, or one of the several varieties of institutional failure that lead to ward closures in underfunded regional hospitals. I had never looked into it very carefully. It had seemed, at the time I started at Hargrove Memorial 4 years ago, like something that had been adequately resolved. I opened the chart to the nursing notes. The entries were dated November 14th through November 19th, written in 3 different hands, the familiar shorthand of hospital documentation, vital signs, medication records, nursing assessments. Then a gap. Then a single entry dated November 20th, 2013, in handwriting that was harder to read than the others, rounder, more pressured, as though written under duress. Patient unresponsive 314. Code blue called. Resuscitation efforts ongoing. That was the last entry. No outcome notation. No time of death. No discharge summary. Just those 2 sentences and then the white space of the remaining page, and beneath it the rest of the blank documentation forms, unfilled, waiting. I looked at my phone. 3:14 a.m. Still 3:14 a.m. I looked again. The seconds counter on my phone's lock screen was moving. I could see it incrementing. 3 hours 14 minutes and 22 seconds. 3 hours 14 minutes and 23 seconds. 3 hours 14 minutes and 24 seconds. The seconds were passing. Only the minutes had stopped. I heard him before I saw him. I had been standing at the bedside, holding the chart, trying to formulate a sequence of actions that made sense within the context of the situation as I understood it. Which was to say, a sequence of actions that made sense within no context I had ever encountered. When the monitor, which I had silenced, began to alarm again. Not the flatline tone this time. The more urgent, staccato alert of a rhythm the machine didn't recognize. I looked at the screen and the waveform there was wrong in a way that took me a moment to categorize. It was the waveform of a heart in ventricular tachycardia, the rapid and ineffective quivering that precedes full arrest. The kind of waveform that, on an active ward, would clear a room of every available nurse and physician within 90 seconds. But the lead wires were still dangling free. Nothing was connected to the machine. And in the bed, the blanket had changed. It was flat a moment ago. I had pulled it back myself and felt the emptiness beneath it. But now it was raised again, that same body-shaped elevation, unmistakable, a person lying on their back. And this time there was more. The pillow bore the impression of a head. The blanket moved, subtly, with the shallow rhythm of labored breathing. I moved to the bedside and reached toward the shape, and my hand did not pass through it. There was resistance, not solid, not the firm resistance of flesh and bone, but something. A pressure. A boundary. Like pushing your hand into cold water, that initial resistance at the surface tension before you break through. I pushed further and the resistance increased, and then, a sound very close, directly in front of me, almost in my ear, a gasping inhalation. Desperate. Drowning. I jerked my hand back. The shape in the bed was still. I became aware that I was not alone in the room. There were people in the room. I do not mean that clearly because I cannot describe it clearly even now. They were not there in the way that I was there, present, solid, casting shadows, displacing air. They were there the way a photograph is there, dimensional, contextual, but belonging to a different order of existence than the room that currently contained it. 3 of them. 2 nurses and a physician, moving around the bed with the urgent, choreographed efficiency of a resuscitation team in progress. Performing CPR. Drawing medications into syringes. Adjusting equipment. And in the bed, visible through them, or rather, in the same space they occupied but somehow not coincident with them, existing at a different depth of the scene, a man. White-haired. His face turned slightly toward me, his eyes open, his expression the specific expression of a person who is simultaneously in terrible pain and profoundly frightened and already beginning to understand that neither of those things will matter very much longer. His eyes were looking directly at me. I want to be precise about this because it matters and because I have spent a great deal of time since that night trying to determine whether I imagined it or rationalized it or simply constructed it from the available materials of fear and exhaustion and an overactive mind. His eyes were looking at me with full and specific attention. Not through me. Not past me. At me. The way one person looks at another when they need something, when they are not yet past the point of needing things, when there is still time. I opened my mouth to say something. I don't know what I would have said, and the scene collapsed. Like a photograph being torn. The nurses, the physician, the urgency and motion and equipment. All of it gone in an instant, leaving only the empty room, the dusty surfaces, the damp warm blanket lying flat on the empty bed, the monitor running its meaningless waveform off disconnected leads. And the door, which had been closed, was open. From the corridor beyond, footsteps. Not mine. Moving away from me. I followed them. I am aware that this is the point in any account of this kind where the reasonable reader begins to question the judgment of the narrator. I questioned my own judgment in real time as I moved through the doorway and into the corridor of Ward 7 North at, according to my phone, which had still not advanced past 3:14 in the morning. I was tired. I had been awake for 9 hours on a 12-hour shift. I had encountered something that my brain was not able to process within its normal operating parameters, and one known response to that kind of overwhelming input is confabulation, the brain's tendency to fill the gaps in its understanding with story. I told myself all of this. It did not help. The footsteps were real. I could hear them clearly, a single set, unhurried, the specific sound of soft-soled shoes on linoleum, moving down the corridor away from me. I could see in the disturbed dust on the floor fresh tracks. But the corridor was empty. I followed the tracks and the sound toward the nursing station, and as I moved through the amber half-light I became aware of a change in the wing around me. The rooms I passed were no longer silent. Each one leaked some fragment of sound, a murmured exchange, a cough, the soft mechanical rhythm of equipment in use. And through the small windows in the doors, light, the specific, cool, blue-white light of active wards, fluorescent and humming. As though behind each door, the wing was operational. As though behind each door, it was November 2013 and the patients were sleeping and the nurses were charting and the ordinary machinery of a hospital night was in motion. I put my hand on the door of room 708, the room I'd heard crying from on my way down the corridor, and I stopped. Because behind that door, very clearly, I heard a voice. Not crying now. Talking. Low and steady and calm in the way that voices on phones are calm when the person is performing calm rather than feeling it. When the person is talking to a family member at 2 in the morning to report a change in condition, and the words being chosen are careful and the tone is controlled, but underneath both of them is a current of knowledge that the situation is not going to resolve the way the person on the other end of the line is hoping. No, there's no change, the voice said. He's stable for now. The doctor thinks, yes, I know. Try to sleep if you can. I'll call you if anything changes. Pause. I promise, the voice said. And then, softer, intended for no one, God, I hope I can keep that one. I stood with my hand on the door and did not open it. I do not know why I didn't. Fear partly. But also something else. The sense that what was behind that door was not intended for me. That I would be intruding on something that had its own completeness, its own enclosed integrity. That opening the door would be like tearing the photograph, and whatever existed there would collapse the same way the scene in room 712 had collapsed, and the voice on the other side would be lost again to the silence. I moved on. At the nursing station, the footsteps stopped. I stopped too. The station was as I'd left it. The bare counter, the empty chart holder, the phone without a cord. But the monitor, the one with the cardiac waveform, had changed. The display now showed a name, Aldridge J.M. And beneath the name, in the rhythm of the waveform, something I hadn't noticed before. It was slowing. Very slightly, very gradually, the way a heartbeat slows at the end of exertion. Or at the end of everything else. From behind me, directly behind me, close enough that the sound of it raised every hair on the back of my neck. Breathing. I turned slowly. There was no one there. The corridor behind me was empty, the amber light lying flat and even over the undisturbed dust in the areas I had not yet walked through. But the breathing continued, not a sound I realized so much as a sensation. A warmth at my left side, moving with me when I turned. A presence that occupied no visual space but that I was as certain of as I was certain of the floor under my feet and the walls on either side of me. I have been a nurse for 15 years. I have been present at many deaths. I want to say this carefully and without melodrama, because melodrama is the enemy of truth and I am trying to tell the truth about this. In those 15 years, I have occasionally been in the presence of something I could not account for. A quality of the air in a room where someone is actively dying that differs from the quality of air in a room where someone has recently died. A sense, in certain rooms at certain moments, of attention, of being watched or accompanied by something I could not see. I had always categorized these perceptions as the products of stress and exhaustion and the particular emotional weight of the work. I had always filed them tidily, in the drawer marked not for further examination. The presence beside me in Ward 7 North was not something I could file anywhere. "Okay," I said aloud. My voice sounded very small in the silence of the wing. "Okay. What do you need me to do?" The breathing, the sensation shifted. Pulled, slightly, in the direction of the corridor ahead, toward the emergency exit doors at the far end of the wing, past room 712. I followed it. Beyond room 712, the corridor continued for perhaps 10 meters before reaching the exit doors, two large metal fire doors, their push-bar handles dull with disuse. But the corridor was not empty here. Against the wall between the last two rooms, half in shadow, a wheelchair stood. Old model, chrome frame, the kind that had been standard in the early 2000s. Its footrests were down as though someone had just stood up from it and walked away. The wheelchair was not facing the wall. It was facing me. As I watched, it moved. Not dramatically, not a sudden lurch across the linoleum. Just a slow, deliberate rotation, perhaps 5 degrees, so that it was pointing slightly more directly at me. The way a thing moves when weight shifts within it. The way it moves when someone sits in it and adjusts their position. I did not run. I am telling you this not to establish my bravery. I don't think I was brave. I think I was caught somewhere on the far side of fear in a place where the ordinary responses no longer applied, but because it's relevant to what happened next. I stood and looked at the wheelchair, and the wheelchair was still, and I moved my eyes to the door beside it. Room 714. Not a patient room. This far end of the corridor held support rooms. A storage room, a treatment room, and if I remembered the floor plan correctly from the building schematics I'd reviewed years ago, a crash room. A room with more space and more equipment than a standard patient room, designed specifically for resuscitation procedures. The door to room 714 was slightly ajar. Blue-white light spilled from the gap. The crash room was fully lit and fully equipped and fully occupied, and none of this was possible, and I walked in anyway. It was larger than I expected, perhaps 4 times the size of a standard patient room, with built-in equipment stations on 3 walls and a central resuscitation bay with a hard surface gurney and full lighting overhead. The lights above the gurney were on, surgical bright, the specific intensity of lights designed to make no shadow, to illuminate everything. The room was full of people. 6 of them, maybe 7, figures in scrubs and white coats, arranged around the gurney with the focused, intense, slightly mechanical quality of a team in the middle of a code. CPR in progress. A figure at the head of the gurney, 2-handed compressions, counting rhythm. Another at the crash cart, drawing up medication. Another at the head, I could see the blue draping, the laryngoscope handle, managing the airway. It was all correct. It was all exactly right, the choreography of a resuscitation that I have performed and witnessed hundreds of times, every movement in its place. And it was all happening 11 years ago. I understood this not from any single piece of evidence but from the gestalt of it. The model of the defibrillator, which was an older unit not used by Hargrove Memorial since about 2015. The design of the scrubs, slightly different from the current standard. The style of the crash cart, the labels, the small institutional details that accumulate to produce a recognizable era. I was watching November 2013. I was watching the code that the nursing notes in room 712 had documented and never concluded. The man on the gurney was John Aldridge. I recognized him from the glimpse I'd had in room 712, white-haired, his face in the same expression of pain and fear. But the expression had changed slightly, or was in the process of changing. The fear was fading. Not into peace, not into the resigned tranquility that is sometimes described in accounts of the dying, but into something else. Something that looked like waiting. Like listening. Like looking for someone. "I'm here," I said. My voice again very small. No one in the room responded. The team continued their work, precise and urgent and absolutely unaware of me. I moved through them, not quite through, there was that resistance again at each boundary, that cold water sensation, and stood beside the gurney beside John Aldridge and looked at his face. His eyes found mine immediately. There it was again, that focused, specific attention. The look of a person who has been waiting for a particular person to arrive and has just seen them come through the door. I looked at the monitor above the gurney. The waveform was there, the slow slowing rhythm I'd been tracking since the nursing station. The rate was dropping, 40, 38, 35. The pattern becoming wider, longer between beats, like footsteps slowing before they stop. On the other side of the gurney, the physician, I couldn't see his face, he was turned away, called something to the team. The team responded. The rhythm of the compressions shifted. A medication was pushed. The monitor registered it. A brief, hopeful uptick in rate, 38 climbing to 42, 44, and then falling back. 40, 37, 34. What do you want me to do? I asked John Aldrich. My voice was no longer small. I had been a nurse for 15 years and I was in the presence of a patient who needed something, and that reoriented me in a way that nothing else in that room could have. Tell me what you need. His lips moved. No sound. His face was covered by a non-rebreather mask. The team was ventilating him. The speech center of his brain was getting whatever oxygen the compressions could provide and no more. But his lips moved with the deliberate, exaggerated articulation of someone trying to be understood across a barrier. I read his lips. 3 words. The same 3 words twice clearly, let it end. I understood in that moment what I was looking at. John Aldrich had been dying in this room for 11 years. Not continuously, not without interruption, not in any way that mapped onto the linear experience of time as I understood it. But in this room, in this wing, in the amber-lit, dust-preserved, clock-stopped space of Ward 7 North, the moment of his death had been suspended, held open, like a door that's been propped ajar. The hinge working, the mechanism intact, but the door never quite swinging shut. I don't know why. I don't think I'm meant to know why. The archives of human experience are full of places where something became stuck, where grief or trauma or simple terrible bad luck created a kind of temporal eddy, a pocket in the fabric of ordinary time where a moment continued to replay. Most of those stories involve the place and not the person. A room where a sound recurs. A hallway where a figure is glimpsed. The ghost, in the conventional understanding, is a residue, an impression left in the material of a place by the violence of an ending. But John Aldrich was not a residue. He was present. He was aware. And what he had been doing in the 11 years since that November night when the last entry in his chart trailed off into white space, what he had been doing looping through the 3:14 a.m. of November 20th, 2013 over and over and over, was waiting. Waiting for someone to hear the code. Waiting for someone to come to the room. Waiting for someone to stand beside him and bear witness to the permission he needed. The team continued their work. The monitor showed 32, 30, 28. Okay, I said. Okay, I hear you. I'm here. I reached into the emergency response bag on my shoulder and took out the defibrillator. Not because I intended to use it. I want to be clear about that. The gesture was not medical, it was ceremonial or perhaps testimonial. The act of a nurse who is present and doing their job and acknowledging the reality of the person in front of them. I placed the pads against the gurney in the space the team occupied, passing through that cold water resistance, and I looked at John Aldrich and I said, clearly and with the full weight of 15 years of professional witness behind it, you can go. This code is called. There is nothing more that needs to be done here. The monitor showed 24, 20. The team's movement slowed. Not stopped. Slowed, the way a recording slows when the mechanism is failing, the specific deceleration of a thing running down. The physician at the head of the gurney turned, slowly, and I thought I might see his face, but he didn't have one. I mean that not as a horror story flourish but as a plain description. Where his face should have been, there was simply the smooth, featureless surface of someone who had never been fully realized in whatever dimension this was. A figure in a memory but not a person from it. The compression stopped. The room went very quiet. John Aldrich's eyes were still on mine. The expression in them had completed its shift. The pain gone now, and the fear gone, and the waiting gone too, replaced by something that I am going to call relief because I don't have another word for it, a profound and unambiguous relief, the specific quality of a person who has been holding on to something for too long and has just been given permission to let go. The monitor line went flat. The flatline tone that I'd heard when I first entered room 712, that single, sustained, unwavering note, came again. And this time it felt like a resolution. Not a failure. A resolution. The light in the room dimmed. Not quickly, slowly, the way a stage light fades at the end of a scene, giving you time to understand that the scene is ending before it's gone. The team dissolved into the amber light and then into nothing. The crash cart, the gurney, the equipment on the walls, all of it fading back into the dust and the disuse, back into the abandoned wing version of room 714 that was the room's actual present. The light above the gurney was the last thing to go, and in the last moment of it, the gurney was empty. Just a hard surface in a dark room. I stood alone in the crash room of Ward 7 North, in the dark, and listened to the flatline tone resolve into silence. I left the wing the same way I'd come in. The corridor was dark when I stepped back out of room 714, the amber light gone, the sourceless glow that had accompanied me since I'd come through the fire door extinguished. I used my flashlight and I walked back through the wing, and I did not hear any sounds from behind the doors of the other rooms. The dust on the floor was undisturbed in the way that 11-year-old dust is undisturbed, settled and complete, with no recent marks except my own footprints from my entry. The wheelchair by the wall was still, facing the wall. I pushed through the fire door and went down the stairs, one flight, and emerged into the light and sound of the 6th-floor corridor, and stood there for a moment while the ordinary sounds of a hospital at night reclaimed my senses. The ventilation hum, the distant Pennsylvania, the specific percussion of a gurney being wheeled across a threshold. Denny was at the nursing station. He looked up when I came through the stairwell door, and the look on his face was the look of someone who has been doing a very specific kind of waiting, the waiting that begins when the person you're watching for has been gone too long and the ordinary explanations for their absence have been exhausted one by one. How long was I up there? I asked. He checked the clock on the station wall. About 40 minutes, he said. I was about to. Did you reach anyone? Dr. Voss called back. I told her about the alarm. She said it must have been a system fault, said she'd have facilities look at it in the morning. He paused. She seemed pretty sure of that. Did she? I set the emergency response bag back on its hook. I tried to reach facilities directly. Their line is still down. He was watching me carefully. Are you okay? What was up there? I thought about how to answer this question. I thought about the chart with the entry that ended mid-sentence. The indentation in the mattress, warm. The eyes of a man who had been waiting 11 years to be seen. The slow slowing of the waveform. The way the light had faded. A system fault, I said. Like Dr. Voss said. He continued watching me for a moment with the evaluating attention of a young person who is not entirely credulous. Then he nodded and picked up the sheet he'd been folding when the alarm came through 40 minutes and 11 years ago. I sat down at the nursing station and opened the incident report form on the computer. I filled out the fields: time, location, nature of the alert, findings, actions taken. In the findings field, I typed, Ward 7 North. No patients, no staff, no active equipment. Source of alarm not identified. No further action required. I submitted the form. I looked at the clock on the wall. 3:58 a.m. The minutes moving again. The seconds moving again. I poured out the cold coffee and made a fresh cup. I sat in the chair at the nursing station and I did not look at the old intercom panel on the wall. I looked at the active monitors, the normal waveforms of the patients in 6 South's beds, the steady evidence of living hearts going about the ordinary business of keeping people alive. I looked at these for a long time. At 4:15 I looked at the intercom panel. The red indicator light was off. The speaker grill was dark and silent and clogged with dust the way it had always been. I exhaled. I picked up my pen and began my standard nursing notes for the shift. 3 days later, at the start of my next shift, I went to the records office. I told the records manager that I was doing a routine audit and needed to see the archived files from Ward 7 North's closure in December 2013. She gave me a look that suggested she was familiar with the particular variety of curiosity I was displaying, and not entirely comfortable with it, but she pulled the files and set them on the counter and left me with them. The incident report from November 20, 2013, was 2 pages long and had been filed by the ward supervisor of the time, a person named Graciela Matos, whose name I did not recognize. It described, in the flat institutional language of official documentation, the following: a patient in room 712, one John Michael Aldridge, admitted November 14th with acute MI, had gone into cardiac arrest at 3:14 a.m. on November 20th. A code blue had been called. The team had responded and initiated resuscitation in the crash room, room 714. Resuscitation efforts had continued for 47 minutes before the attending physician, Dr. Harold Vanek, had called the code. Time of death, 4:01 a.m., November 20th, 2013. 47 minutes. The resuscitation had run from 3:14 to 4:01. The same 40 minutes, roughly, that I'd spent on the ward. I read the rest of the incident report. There had been a complication during the code, not medical but logistical. The code blue alarm system for Ward 7 North had malfunctioned during the resuscitation, failing to alert the full response team. Several staff members who should have been present had not received the call. The crash had been handled by an undersized team, and Dr. Vanek had documented his concern that the outcome might have been different with full staffing. Ward 7 North had been closed for review of the alarm malfunction the following month. The review had identified a fault in the intercom system. The wing had been decommissioned pending renovation, and the renovation had never been funded. I set down the file. John Aldridge had died because not enough people heard the alarm. He had spent 11 years sending it again, looping back to 314, calling the code blue into whatever frequency of reality was accessible from wherever he was, waiting for someone to respond. Waiting for the team that should have come. Or waiting, maybe, for something simpler than that. Waiting for someone to come into that room and stand beside him and say, "I hear you. You can stop now." I thought about that for a long time, standing at the records counter with the file in my hands. I put the file back. I thanked the records manager. I went up to my ward and started my shift. I did not go back to the 7th floor. I did not think about Ward 7 North during the rest of that shift, or the shift after that, or the several shifts after that. Until the night, 2 weeks later, midnight, a quiet Tuesday, when the intercom panel on the wall of the 6 South nursing station flickered. I was alone at the desk. I saw it from the corner of my eye, a brief illumination of the dusty speaker grill, a single pulse of the indicator light, red, warm, unmistakable. Then dark. I sat very still. Nothing followed. No announcement. No crackling automated voice. No sound of any kind from the panel. I sat at the desk for the rest of that shift without taking my eyes from the intercom panel for longer than it took to complete a necessary task. And for the duration of that shift, between midnight and 7 a.m., 7 hours, the panel remained dark. I told myself it had been nothing. A voltage irregularity in old wiring. A remnant of whatever fault had caused the first incident. I'm writing this 11 days after that second night. I'm writing it because the panel flickered again last week. And the week before. Always once, always brief, always when I am alone at the desk and the ward is quiet and it is somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning. I am telling myself several things. I am telling myself that the wiring in this building is old and unreliable and that flickering indicators and old panels are not unusual. I am telling myself that what I experienced on Ward 7 North was a combination of exhaustion and suggestion and the powerful human need to find meaning in things that may have no meaning. I am telling myself that John Aldridge has been dead for 11 years and that whatever moment he occupied in that wing, whatever loop, whatever eddy in the normal passage of time, I closed it when I went to him. I told him to let go. The waveform flatlined and the lights went out and the dust settled back over everything and it was done. I am telling myself these things with the determined, repetitive emphasis of someone who does not entirely believe them. Because here is what I cannot account for, in the tidy narrative of a successful resolution. The indentation in the mattress of room 712 was warm when I pressed my hand into it. Fresh warm. Body warm. The warm of someone who had been there recently, who had just risen. If John Aldridge was looping through the moment of his death, returning to 3:14 a.m. on November 20, 2013, over and over, calling the code blue, waiting, then where had he been between loops? Between 3:14 and the next? Between one attempt to call for help and the next, in the ordinary hours of the ordinary hospital day? Had he been lying in room 712, still and patient and warm, waiting for 3:14 to come again? And if I closed the loop, if the code was finally called, if the witness was finally present, if the moment finally finished its arc and the flatline tone finally, blessedly, meant what it is supposed to mean, then why does the panel flicker? Why does it flicker at 3 in the morning? Why does it flicker when I'm alone? And why, last night, when I was doing my rounds on 6 South at 3:13 a.m., and I passed the stairwell door and stood outside it for a moment listening, why did I hear, from somewhere above me, from somewhere that has been sealed and dark and empty for 11 years, the sustained and unwavering tone of a cardiac monitor? Not a flat line. A heartbeat. 45 beats per minute. Slow. Steady. Waiting. I put my hand on the stairwell door. I stood there for a long time with my hand on the door. Then I took my hand away and continued my rounds and told myself what I have been telling myself since that night, with decreasing conviction and increasing dread, that the code was called, that the team responded, that the patient was seen, that it was enough, that it was finally, mercifully enough. The panel flickered again at 4 a.m. I'm back on shift tonight. It is currently 2:47. The intercom panel is dark. For now. Hargrove Memorial Hospital Ward 7 North remains closed. The building is scheduled for partial renovation, pending funding. The renovation has been pending for 11 years. Ward 7 North has not been officially decommissioned. It remains in hospital records listed as inactive, not permanently closed. The distinction is administrative. It is the kind of distinction that implies the possibility of reopening. It is 3:13 a.m.